So we've covered the Greco-Roman background to the New Testament. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to cover or at least in this lecture, I shouldn't say today, but in this lecture, we are going to cover the Jewish background to the New Testament. So as I was telling you last time, the New Testament world, the world of early Christianity, has two backgrounds to it. One background is the world of Greece and Rome, which we call the Greco-Roman world. The second background is the world of ancient Judaism, or what is sometimes called Second Temple Judaism. And this Judaism, Second Temple Judaism, or ancient Judaism, is a product not just of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible or the ancient Israelite religion that comes out of the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible, but it's also a product of the world that is created after the time of Alexander the Great. It's also a product of a Hellenized world, a product of Hellenization. Now, if we were looking at the books of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, chronologically speaking, the Hebrew Bible, the books of the Hebrew Bible would have you believe that the history of the Hebrew Bible ends around the year 500 BCE. So about 200 years, give or take, before Alexander. That's what they'd have you believe. But if you actually ever study the books of the Old Testament, you realize that the last book in the Old Testament is probably the prophet Daniel. And it was written around the year 200 BCE, so after the time of Alexander, even though the history it's supposedly describing goes back before the year 200 to about the year 500. So it acts as if it's talking about events that are much earlier when it's actually talking about events after the time of Alexander. The context for the book of Daniel, and I'm going to talk a bit about it here in this lecture, and then we're going to come back to it later on in this course when we talk about the historical Jesus. The context of the book of Daniel is really those generals that were Alexander's generals that came after him, that divided up his empire and were fighting over who's now in charge now that Alexander is gone. And after the time of Alexander, you get these two groups. You get one group of individuals known as the Ptolemies who are down in Egypt, and you get another group known as the Seleucids who are in Syria. And the Seleucids and the Ptolemies come out of these squabbles between Alexander's generals after his death. And these two groups are going to cause some issues. They're going to cause some problems for the Jewish people because the land of Israel-Palestine is essentially stuck in between these two groups, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. The group that causes the most problems for the Jews of this period are in fact the Seleucids. And there's a particular individual that comes out of the Seleucids that creates one of the most, or is the impetus, I should say, for one of the most important stories, important events even, that occurs in Second Temple Jewish history. And all New Testament scholars would tell you that once you know this story and you know this history, a lot of what's going on in the books of the New Testament, especially politically, start to make, it all starts to make a bit more sense. So around the year 175 BCE, so we're well before the writings of the New Testament, we're well before the time of Jesus, there was a Seleucid leader named Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And Antiochus IV became the ruler of the Seleucid faction of Alexander's empire. So he's up in Syria. Now, just to explain a bit about Antiochus to you, this term, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, Epiphanes is a title, which means God manifest. So this gets you into his mindset. He's one of those divine rulers, or at least he thinks he's a divine ruler. And he's going to take this pretty far, demanding loyalty to him, demanding loyalty to the Seleucid Empire demanding loyalty to, in terms of people even just worshiping him as a deity on earth. Well, while Antiochus is ascending the throne in the Seleucid Empire, you also have around this time two Jewish leaders in Israel Palestine that are fighting it out with one another for who's actually in charge. On the one hand, you have an individual named Jason, who is the high priest in the city of Jerusalem. He's rightfully the high priest. And notice here the name Jason. The fact that we're talking about Israel Palestine here in 175 or so BCE, and the high priest is named Jason. Jason is a Greek name. Jason is a Hellenistic name. This tells us right away that Israel Palestine in this period is Hellenized. It's been affected by the Hellenization program of Alexander the Great that occurred years before. So we've got Jason, who is the high priest in Jerusalem, the rightful high priest in Jerusalem. But we have another individual, Menelaus, who has tried to buy the high priesthood for himself and oust Jason. So he's trying to buy supporters who are going to back him over Jason. So there's all this infighting going on between Jason, who's the rightful high priest, and then Menelaus, who wants to be high priest but isn't the rightful high priest. But like in all kinds of political squabbles, if you get enough backing, if you pay the right people, you can take over. So what happens is fighting is breaking out between these two rival groups. There are Jews who support Jason because he's the legitimate high priest, and then you have others who are supporting Menelaus. And in the midst of this, the Jews of this period are struggling with this whole thing called Hellenization. Can we be Jews and can we be Greek? How much of our culture can we syncretize with Greek culture? And I'll come back to that because there's all sorts of different Jewish reactions to that. Well, all this chaos is going on, all this infighting is going on, and Antiochus realizes that there's a problem between Jason and Menelaus in Israel-Palestine. So Antiochus makes the most of this situation, this infighting, and he sees it as an opportunity to just walk in and take control of the city. This becomes sort of this literary motif in this period when it comes to Jews and Judaism. These outside forces come in and they start fighting with Jews and Judaism. And if the Jews were all on one page, they would probably have been able to stave off or fend off these outsiders. But because they can't get on the same page, they run into problems and they end up being defeated by an outside power, by an outside empire. So Antiochus, knowing this chaos is going on, that it's ensuing, he sends Syrian forces to the city of Jerusalem, and he plunders the city and takes over the temple and plunders the temple and does horrible things, desecrates the temple in Jerusalem, the temple to the Jewish God, somewhere around 168, 167 BCE. So we're still about 100 plus, 130 plus years, more than that, before the birth of Jesus. But what's about to happen here is sort of a watershed moment in the history of ancient Judaism that Jews in the time of Jesus haven't forgotten. So what happens is Antiochus comes in and he wipes out the cult to the Jewish god Yahweh. He wipes out the priesthood of the Jewish god, and he replaces that priesthood with a cult to the god Zeus Olympius. So essentially what happens is the Jewish god and that Jewish god's house, the Jewish temple, the focal point of Jewish sacrificial religion, it's gone, and it's replaced now by some syncretized form of Greek Syrian religion. So the house of Yahweh now becomes the house of Zeus Olympius. And in reality, this means Jerusalem isn't Jewish anymore. It's just become fully Greek. It's become something else. Well, this presents all kinds of practical, pragmatic problems for the Jewish people. What do they do? Are they okay with this? Do they fight back? Do they do nothing? Do they assimilate? Well, throughout the period from Alexander the Great, even I would say on through the writings of the New Testament period, Jewish people, the different groups of Jews throughout the empires, throughout the Mediterranean world, are not on the same page as to what to do about something like Hellenization. And later on, they don't really know what to do about Romanization. You have certain groups, and some of these groups appear in the New Testament writings. You have certain groups that wanted to fight and preserve the ways of their ancestors. They wanted a pure Judaism that goes back to the good old days, and they're willing to fight for that. Or they're willing to ghettoize and say, we're not going to be part of the larger world. We're going to go do our own thing. You have groups that say, it's not worth it. Let's give up on the old ways. Let's assimilate to the new ways. Let's become part of the modern world. You have other groups that are looking for a middle position on all of this. And a lot of this plays out with different groups that are in the narrative, the four narratives that we call the Gospels. So when you get to the Gospels, you'll have Jewish groups like the Sadducees. The Sadducees are essentially the priests running the Jewish temple in the period of the New Testament. And when we get to the New Testament period, the Sadducees are priests that have decided to compromise with imperialism. They're compromising with the Roman Empire. You have a group of individuals called the Pharisees who are more on the side of the Jewish people, who are looking for a middle way to save the people, but they also want to preserve the ancestral customs of their forefathers and foremothers. You have a group of individuals known as the Essenes that decide to rebel against the whole thing, and they pack their bags and move to the desert and start writing these things that we today call the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, they are never mentioned directly in the New Testament, but some of their teachings seem to be known to Jesus, particularly in the Sermon on the Mount. And the Essenes are waiting on God to come and judge empires like the Roman Empire and to overthrow them and to restore the kingdom of God on earth. And then you have zealots mentioned in the New Testament. These are groups of Jews that go under various names, zealots, the fourth philosophy, etc., that think, why should we wait on God? Maybe our reaction to Hellenization and later to Romanization should simply be to fight back on our own, to push the hand of God, to, instead of waiting on God to come and judge our enemies, that maybe we should do it ourselves. Maybe we should take up arms against our oppressors. And then you have apocalyptic Jews, which we'll talk about more. We'll see this certainly with the book of Daniel a bit today. We'll talk about it more when we get to the historical Jesus, because almost every historian today thinks that Jesus fits in with apocalyptic Judaism. What I mean by that very, very briefly is apocalyptic Jews are individuals that thought the space-time continuum was going to end very, very soon, that God was going to show up, separate the righteous from the unrighteous, restore the kingdom to Israel. And then you have groups like the Hasidim, not to be confused with Hasids in New York City, but the Hasidim were very pious, very righteous, almost charismatic Jews that wanted to preserve the ancestral ways. Sometimes that was through fighting, sometimes that was not, but these were the righteous ones. And then you have all kinds of other groups, and you simply have the everyday, ordinary, average Jew, what are called the Am Haaretz in Hebrew, the people of the land, that are just trying to get along and pay the bills and make everything work and survive this. Well, some Jews decide to fight back. And if you take that option of let's fight back, and you go back to the time of Antiochus IV, this means that if you're going to fight back, you're going to fight back against Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and you're going to fight back against all these forces of Hellenization. You're going to say, look, we don't want you in our land. You've colonized us, you've oppressed us, and so we're going to take matters into our own hands and we're going to fight back. So in the section of the New Oxford Annotated Bible, either called the Apocrypha or the Deuterocanonical books, there are a couple of books known as the books of the Maccabees. And in particular here, I'm thinking about 1 Maccabees and 2 Maccabees. And the story about the fight that a certain group of Jews has, in particular one Jewish family has, against Antiochus and the forces of Hellenization, occurs in these books known as 1 and 2 Maccabees. Now, if you ever have a chance, I would certainly suggest reading this, because one of the main historical sources that's missing, if people simply just read through the Hebrew Bible, read through the Old Testament, and then try to come to the New Testament, one of the main stories that's missing is this story called the Maccabean Revolt, and it's sitting in the Apocrypha in 1 Maccabees, 2 Maccabees. Even Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox Christians that have these books as part of their Bibles often don't read these books, but they should. In fact, as you'll see, the Jewish story of Hanukkah comes out of 1 Maccabees and 2 Maccabees and the story of the Maccabean Revolt. Well, to give you a brief overview of this story, what happens is there's a man named Mattathias. And Mattathias is a priest from the city of Jerusalem. But he settles in a village called Modein, Modein. And the way the story goes is that officers from the king arrive in the village of Modein, and they order the villages to sacrifice to foreign gods. Now, the text isn't specific on this, but it seems to be what they're saying is, we want you to sacrifice to these Greek gods and goddesses, or to foreign gods and goddesses. And all of this occurs in 2 Maccabees, or in 1 Maccabees rather, chapter 2, verses 1 through 18. So I'm gonna read 2 Maccabees chapter 1 or chapter 2 verses. I'm gonna read 1 Maccabees. Let me try that again. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 18 to you here. This starts on page 1561 of the New Oxford Annotated Bible. In those days, Mattathias, son of John, son of Simeon, a priest of the family of Jorib, moved from Jerusalem and settled in Modein. He had 5 sons: John named Gadi, Simon called Thasi, Judas called Maccabeus, Eleazar called Avaran, and Jonathan called Aphus. He saw the blasphemies being committed in Judah and Jerusalem, and said, "Alas, why was I born to see this, the ruin of my people, the ruin of the holy city, and to live there when it was given over to the enemy, the sanctuary given over to aliens?" And he's referring to the fact that Antiochus had come in and desecrated the temple and desecrated the city. Her temple has become like a person without honor. Her glorious vessels have been carried into exile. Her infants have been killed in her streets, her youths by the sword of the foe. What nation has not inherited her palaces and has not seized her spoils? All her adornment has been taken away, no longer free. She's become a slave. And see, our holy place, our beauty, and our glory have been laid waste. The Gentiles, so that's going to be the Syrians, Antiochus, the Seleucids, have profaned them. Why should we live any longer? Then Mattathias and their sons tore their clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned greatly. The king's officers who were enforcing the apostasy came to the town of Modein to make them offer sacrifice. Many from Israel came to them, and Mattathias and his sons were assembled. And the king's officer spoke to Mattathias as follows: "You are a leader honored and great in this town and supported by sons and brothers. Now be the first to come and do what the king commands, as all the Gentiles and the people of Judah and those that are left in Jerusalem have done. Then you and your sons will be numbered among the friends of the king, and you and your sons will be honored with silver and gold and many gifts." So Mattathias is being offered here. He's been invited. He's basically being coerced into offering sacrifice to the gods of the Gentiles. But he's not going to do it. So the story goes on. But Mattathias answered and said in a loud voice, "Even if all the nations that live under the rule of the king obey him, and have chosen to obey his commandments, every one of them abandoning the religion of their ancestors, I and my sons and my brothers will continue to live by the covenant. of our ancestors. Far be it from us to desert the laws and the ordinances. We will not obey the king's words by turning aside from our religion to the right hand or to the left. And the story goes on, and instead of Mattathias offering sacrifice, another Jew comes forward, and that Jew decides he's going to do this. And Mattathias is enraged, and in righteousness, this would be an example of righteous anger, so to speak. Mattathias kills this other Jew. And then Mattathias kills the king's representative, and then he flees with his sons to the hills. When he had finished speaking, this is starting in verse 23, when he had finished speaking these words, a Jew came forward in the midst of all to sacrifice on the altar in Modain, according to the king's command. When Mattathias saw it, he burned with zeal, and his heart was stirred. He gave vent to righteous anger. He ran and killed him on the altar. At the same time, he killed the king's officer who was forcing them to sacrifice, and he tore down the altar. Thus he burned with zeal for the law, just as Phinehas did against Zimri, son of Salu. So, when Mattathias engages in this act, he's an example. He's a paradigmatic individual who says, I am not putting up with the process of Hellenization anymore. Enough is enough. I'm tired of people like Antiochus. I'm tired of the Seleucids. I'm also tired, though, of my fellow Jews who are giving in. And so he fights back. And when he and his sons flee, what they do is they basically go out into the desert and they begin this program of what we would call guerrilla-style warfare against Antiochus and his army. And because Mattathias and his sons know the land so well, better than Antiochus and his army, that they can hide, they can fight, they can engage in these brief acts of terrorism, and they cause a number of problems for Antiochus and his army. Well, one day, Mattathias dies, and his leadership passes from himself to his son, who's called Judas. And I'm going to flip over here to 2 Maccabees, chapter 10, which is on page 1620. And Judas is called Judas Maccabeus, or Judas the Maccabee. Maccabee is actually a title, and the title of his name is the Hammer. So this tells you a lot about Judas. Judas is Judas the Hammer. It's kind of like a mafia title. And somehow, against all odds, in the two books of the Maccabees attributes this to the providence of God, Judas eventually rids the land of Antiochus and his army. So this ragtag group of rebels, who are rabble-rousers, they end up defeating an empire against all odds. And in the year 164 BCE, they march into Jerusalem. They take back the temple to their God Yahweh. They restore it. And we get a celebration in Jewish history, celebrated down to this day, known as Hanukkah, or the Feast of Dedication, or the Feast of Lights, when they rededicate the temple in Jerusalem back to their God. And in the second book of Maccabees, chapter 10, starting at verse 1, we read a bit about this. Now Maccabeus and his followers, the Lord leading them on, recovered the temple in the city. They tore down the altars that had been built in the public square by the foreigners. And also they destroyed the sacred precincts. They purified the sanctuary. They made another altar of sacrifice. Then, striking fire out of flint, they offered sacrifice after a lapse of 2 years. And they offered incense and lighted lamps and set out the bread of the presence. These are just different elements that are supposed to be in the temple to the Jewish God. When they had done this, they fell prostrate and implored the Lord that they might never again fall into such misfortunes, but that if they should ever sin, that they might be disciplined by God with forbearance and not be handed over to blasphemous and barbarous nations. It happened on that same day on which the sanctuary had been profaned by the foreigners. The purification of the sanctuary took place. That is, on the 25th day of the same month, which was Kislev. They celebrated it for 8 days. This is Hanukkah. They celebrated it for 8 days with rejoicing in the manner of the Festival of Booths, remembering how not long before, during the Festival of Booths, they had been wandering in the mountains and caves like wild animals, therefore carrying ivy-wreathed wands and beautiful branches, also fronds of palm. They offered hymns of thanksgiving to him who had given success to the purifying of his own holy place. They decreed by public edict, ratified by vote, that the whole nation of the Jews should observe these days every year. So they did it. They won against all odds. This small little nation stuck between warring empires fought back, and they did it. They got their land back. They kicked out the oppressors. They kicked out the colonizers. After this happens, the Maccabean family creates what's known as the Jewish Hasmonean dynasty. This is the Great Hasmonean dynasty. And everything is going pretty good for a while for the Jewish people. They've got their land back, they've got their temple back, they've got their ancestry back. And all of this is going to last from about the year 165 to the year 60 BCE. Now, as I put on your timeline, Jesus is born around the year 6 or 4 BCE, so we're still a bit before, a few decades before the time of Jesus. And then around 63 or so BCE, an empire that the Jews never expected is going to show up, and that's going to be the Roman Empire, and that's going to change everything. And once again, the Jewish people are going to be in a situation they were with Antiochus, where they're in their land, but they don't really have control of it. They don't really have autonomy. It's sort of like they're slaves, they're prisoners in their own land. They're colonized by a foreign power. So there's this book in the Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament known as the Book of Daniel, which when you read it, Daniel is presented in the narrative as a prophet. And the Book of Daniel is like all prophecies and all apocalyptic books is written in code. And if you don't know the code, you can totally miss what the book is about. The Book of Daniel acts like it's talking about a time in the past, well in the past, when the Jewish people were taken into exile by the Babylonians. But it's not talking about that. It's actually talking about Hellenization, Alexander the Great, Antiochus Epiphanes. So it's a prophecy in quotes. It's a story in code about the kind of Jews who stand up to foreign powers and fight back against foreign oppressors. It's also a book about what it would look like if the kingdom of God was actually established on earth, in Israel, in Jerusalem. The book of Daniel, and we'll come back to it when we talk about the historical Jesus, but for our purposes right now, the book of Daniel is divided into 2 basic parts. Chapters 1 through 6 tell this very elaborate story about 3 young Jews who are taken to Babylon, modern-day Iraq. And when they're exiled there, when they're taken out of their homeland, when they're removed from Israel and taken to Babylon, they're basically coaxed into worshiping the gods and goddesses of the Babylonians. But what we find out in this story is that they don't do it, and they're honored by God for not doing that. And what these chapters are all trying to do is these chapters are trying to tell Jewish people, be like these 3 young Jews. Don't bow down to the king of Babylon. Don't bow down to these foreign powers. But again, this story isn't about Babylon. It's about what's going on after Alexander. And then it's going to be reinterpreted and reapplied to the Roman Empire, certainly during the time of Jesus and the New Testament writers. And then in chapters 7 through 12, you get all of these apocalyptic visions. And all of these visions are just codes for things going on after 200 BCE, or things going on around that particular era. It's code about rulers like Antiochus who are represented by all of these animals and other sorts of images. And in the book of Daniel, these visions, these prophecies are really all about how God is going to show back up. God is going to send a Messiah. God is going to help out his people, and God is going to take care of all the things that are broken and fix those things. Now, I don't want to go too deeply into Daniel at the moment. We'll do that later on in this course. But basically what Daniel is doing is it's this apocalyptic book trying to remind Jews of this period that empires are going to come and go. And yes, you're going to get beat up by these empires because the land of Israel stands at a crossroads between some of the great empires of the world. But as one empire replaces another empire, the book of Daniel is saying, if you remain faithful as a Jew, God will one day intervene and fix all of this, and God will reward you for being faithful. Now, we're going to see later on that this is pretty much what Jesus is talking about when he talks about the kingdom of God and when he talks about the end of the world. He's picking all this imagery up from the book of Daniel. When Jesus uses this term, Son of Man, he is referring to the Son of Man title in the book of Daniel. All of early Christianity is apocalyptic like the book of Daniel. Paul thinks this way. Jesus thinks this way. And like I said, just about every historian would say the early Christian movement is an apocalyptic movement. It's looking for God to intervene and fix what's wrong and establish the kingdom of God on earth. So this mindset, going all the way back to the Maccabees, is there for Jews during the time of Jesus, during the time of the New Testament, during the time of the writing of the Gospels. And Jews, even like Jesus, might have heard as a child when they were young stories about the Maccabean revolt, and so there's always this story sitting in the background of the minds of Jews. There was a time in our history when a group of Jews stood up to a powerful empire and actually won, and that story doesn't dissipate; it doesn't go away. In fact, just to highlight some other things from ancient Judaism. Eventually, the Jews are going to have to, like they dealt with Antiochus, they're going to have to decide what they're going to do with the Romans. Around the year 63 BCE, so about 60 years or so before the birth of Jesus, the Roman general Pompey strolls into Jerusalem. And he takes it over. Now, for a while, things aren't all that bad between the Jews and the Romans. They slowly get bad. Mistakes are certainly made on both sides. But what's going on here is there's this pattern in Jewish history of basically Jews kind of gain their autonomy and they gain their freedom for a bit, and an empire shows up and takes it over. But here's the thing. Once you get to the time of Alexander and on down through the Romans, the Jews never get kicked out of their land. They just get colonized in their own land by an outside power. So empire after empire after empire comes. Jews will fight with them. They will get rid of them. Things will be fine for a bit. And another empire shows up and it all starts all over again. It's like history is just repeating itself. And it's during this time that Herod the Great comes about. He's put in charge by the Romans around the year 37 BCE. He's not liked, certainly by many of the Jews. There's all sorts of questions about his ancestry. Is he a real Jew? Is he a full Jew? Is he a half Jew? But he's given the title king by the Romans. He's trusted by the Romans. But he's kind of a puppet king. The strings are certainly being pulled by Rome. And Herod wants to please Rome. Around the year 6 CE, so let's say by the time Jesus is 10 or 12, the province of Judea, the region of Judea in Israel, Palestine, is put under the direct control of the Romans. So when Jesus is an adult, he's in a land that is fully controlled, fully occupied by the Roman Empire. This is why in the life of Jesus and the stories of the Gospels, you often see Jesus encountering Roman soldiers and Roman public officials. What the Romans do after 6 CE is they start putting different Roman governors in charge of the region of Judea. And one of those governors, a very important one, Pontius Pilate, is governor when Jesus is executed, either in the year 30 or 33 CE. In fact, Pilate is the one, at least according to all four of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, all four of those Gospels, is the one who orders the crucifixion of Jesus. He orders the death of Jesus. In fact, crucifixion is a Roman form of capital punishment. Jews cannot order crucifixion of another Jew. All a Jew could do in terms of capital punishment is order stoning of another person, death by stoning. Well, eventually, the tensions keep growing and growing and growing between the Jews and the Romans. And people probably think back to the time of the Maccabees when they did it, when they won, when they kicked this colonizing power out. And as with the Maccabees wanting the Seleucids out of their land, wanting Antiochus out of there, the Jews eventually hit a wall in which they say, all right, we want the Romans out of our land. And so between the years 66 and 74 CE, this is after Jesus and after Paul, the great Jewish revolt against Rome occurs. And you need to remember something about this, is the Gospel of Mark is likely written around the year 70 CE. There are passages in Mark, particularly Mark chapter 13, that sound like the story of the revolt, the Jewish revolt against Rome. And when you read the Gospel of Mark, keep this in mind, that Mark is writing at a time when there is a revolt going on between the Jews and the Romans. And believe it or not, during this time, 66 to 74 CE, the Jews held off the Romans for a very long time. They almost won this whole thing. But the different factions of Jews, whether they were Pharisees, whether they were Essenes, whether they were Zealots, they couldn't all get on the same page. And many scholars think if they could have gotten on the same page, they might have beat back the Romans, which again would have been this miraculous providential act. Well, around the year 70 CE, the Romans march into Jerusalem. They destroy the city of Jerusalem. They destroy the temple of the Jews. And again, this had to look like for the Jewish people that history is repeating itself. We've seen this before in our story. The Jews are kicked out of Jerusalem, but this doesn't stop things. In the 2nd century, between the years 132 and 135 CE, we have the second revolt. The second Jewish revolt against the Rome. There was a second attempt at this that also almost succeeded. This is known as the Bar Kokhba revolt. In fact, many prominent Jewish rabbis supported this individual, Bar Kokhba. Bar Kokhba means the son of the star. And many people thought Bar Kokhba, some very famous rabbis like Rabbi Akiva thought Bar Kokhba was this messianic figure sent by God that was really going to wipe out the Romans this time. And unfortunately, no, it doesn't work. This time, Jerusalem is renamed Aelia Capitolina. It's given a Roman name. It's Romanized. The Jews are totally kicked out. In fact, it's so bad from the first revolt to second revolt that the Jewish people don't come back to Jerusalem until the year 1948. That's the disastrous consequences of this. But it's important to remember that the New Testament is written between the years 50 and 150. This is what's going on in the background, especially for Jews during that time from 50 to 150. You have the first great revolt against the Romans, and you have the second great revolt against the Romans. Now, this history is even though we think of the New Testament writers as being Christians, we have to remember that with the possible exception of Luke, all the writers of the New Testament seem to be Jews who think Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. The New Testament is written against this background. Jesus is a Jew who has Jewish followers. The story of the Maccabean revolt is part of his thinking, part of his history. The history behind the New Testament texts, many of these texts, and I think particularly Mark, is at least the first Jewish revolt, if not other things like the Maccabean revolt. So, as with the world of Greece and Rome, the Greco-Roman world, you know enough at this point to be absolutely dangerous with what is called Second Temple Judaism or Ancient Judaism. But it's important to keep both of these backgrounds in mind when you start reading the Gospels and when you start thinking about Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. And you think about what's going on when they are writing these texts. And are there things in these texts? Are there references in these texts? Not just the things going on in the life and times of Jesus, but things going on in the outside world, like the First Jewish War. So there's some important lessons we can take from all this, some big picture lessons. The first thing is this: Hellenization, making the world Greek, was extremely important for the birth and growth of all Christianity. Judaism is Hellenized, Christianity is Hellenized. You cannot get away from this. Whether you're talking about after the time of Alexander or you're talking about the time of the Roman Empire. By Jesus' time, all of Israel-Palestine is Hellenized. You can't escape this. You probably didn't even realize it if you were the average ordinary Jew living in Israel-Palestine in the first century. Which also means that syncretism was an important part of life for a Jew, and it was an expected feature. Even though people might have been wanting the good old days in their ancestral religion, a pure Judaism, it just doesn't exist. Because even what you think is pure is still Hellenized. The second really important lesson is that Judaism was a very, extremely multi-ethnic and multi-religious entity. And what I mean by that is there is no such thing, if you go back to the time of the New Testament writers or before, there is no such thing as one Judaism. There are Judaisms, plural. And so if somebody asks the question, which is a question that's not a bad question, it's almost impossible to answer. Somebody asks the question, what did Jews in the time of Jesus believe about, pick a subject, the Messiah? The response of a historian really has to be, which group of Jews are you talking about? Some groups don't believe in a Messiah at all. Some groups do. Or if you ask a question like, what did Jews in the time of Jesus believe about the Jewish law? What did they think it meant to even be a Jew? Well, it depends on which group of Jews you're talking about. In other words, there is no normative Judaism back in the first century. It's like somebody today asking, what does a Christian think about this or that issue? Well, it depends on which group of Christians you're talking about, because there isn't just one Christianity. And even today, there isn't just one Judaism. In fact, there is a gigantic distinction between the kind of Judaism that existed in Israel-Palestine and then the kind of Judaism that existed out in the rest of the Roman Empire. The majority of Jews in the first century don't live in Israel-Palestine. They live out in the Roman Empire. While Jews in the land, Israel, might speak Aramaic, Jews living outside of the land probably speak Greek and may not even know Aramaic. The other big thing here to remember is that places like Judea and the city of Jerusalem actually aren't as important in the ancient world as we think. When you're looking at the history of ancient Judaism, a lot of the things that happen to the Jewish people just kind of happen because they're stuck in the middle of world events. They're caught up in more important political struggles that really don't have anything to do with them, but then they get stuck in the middle of stuff going on, and then they react to it, and all kinds of problems happen. And I think you could say the same thing for the early Christians. If you remember this letter from Pliny to Trajan, the Romans really aren't that concerned in the second century with who the Christians are. They're just there. They're caught up in the middle of this thing. And so sometimes the early Christians and the early Jews, they're really in many respects just in the wrong places at the wrong times in history. And the final thing I would say is, like the Romans, like Alexander, like Antiochus, like the Seleucids, like the Ptolemies, these groups that want to take over the world, that want to establish an empire on earth, it's important to remember that the Jewish people themselves also had an ideology of empire. They wanted the kingdom of God on earth. In fact, many scholars have argued, and I think this is true, that this expression that even Jesus uses, the kingdom of God, is better translated as the rule of God or the empire of God on earth. And when it comes to ancient Judaism, ancient Jews have had this mindset for a very long time, going back to their scriptures, that they are the chosen special people of God. That they're supposed to be the light to the nations. They're supposed to teach the true laws of the one true God to the rest of the world. So, in a sense, it's worth thinking of, while these empires are all fighting with the Jews of this period, well, the Jews are also wanting to establish their own empire on earth. Now, we don't often think of that because we want to think of all of this in spiritual and religious terms, but it's important to remember that whether you're talking about the Greco-Roman world or whether you're talking about the ancient Jewish world, there are tons of politics going on in this period. To the point that when you make a statement, in the case of the gospel writers, for example, when you make a statement, that statement isn't just spiritual. That statement isn't just religious. That statement isn't just theological. It's also political. And so as we get ready to move on to the Gospels, keep all of this in mind and just keep thinking of, where do I see this in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John? And when we turn to Mark, really a big key to this is Mark chapter 13, where you see a lot of politics, a lot of things about apocalyptic, a lot of things perhaps about the Jewish revolt against Rome being placed into the mouth of Jesus. And we will talk about that next week.